April 1944. Two armies are entrenched on opposite sides of a residential tennis court. Instead of tennis balls, they are lobbing hand grenades across the ruined white lines. It is a surreal, almost absurd standoff, but the stakes are terrifying. If this tiny patch of dirt falls, the road to India is thrown wide open for the Japanese Empire. On one side of the baseline, the 15,000-strong Japanese 31st Division. On the other, a makeshift force of barely 1,500 combat-capable defenders. As another volley of grenades arcs over the shattered net, one impossible question remains. How did this standoff even begin? To understand how two armies ended up fighting over a net, you have to look at the geography of this remote ridge. Kohima was an administrative outpost, a quiet hill station carved into the mountains of northeast India. But in the spring of 1944, this quiet town became the single most important geographic choke point in the entire Asian theatre. It sat directly astride the Dimapur-Imphal Road, a winding, treacherous mountain highway that served as the only supply artery keeping British and Indian forces alive on the Burmese front. For the Japanese Imperial Army, severing this highway was the ultimate prize. It was the linchpin of Operation Yugo, a massive, theatre-altering offensive designed to shatter the Allied lines, push deep into India, and collapse the British Empire's hold on the subcontinent. If Kohima fell, the vast, completely undefended railway depots of Dimapur were just down the mountain. The entire logistical network would disintegrate. Yet, despite its overwhelming strategic value, the British had not fortified this vital ridge. The men trapped on the Kohima perimeter when the Japanese finally closed the ring were not a specialised vanguard. They were a desperately patched-together garrison of administrative clerks, recovering hospital patients, rear echelon support staff, and scattered mixed infantry units pulled from different divisions. How did this fractured, under-equipped force manage to absorb the momentum of a highly disciplined imperial army? This is the story of how grand strategic ambitions, drawn on vast maps in Tokyo and London, suddenly contracted into a nightmare of point-blank survival on a ruined suburban lawn. But to comprehend how this desperate standoff became possible, we first have to look at the architects behind the Japanese invasion and the catastrophic gamble buried at the very heart of his master plan. The architect of this impending collision was Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, the aggressive and highly ambitious commander of the Japanese 15th Army. Mutaguchi did not just want to sever a road, he wanted to orchestrate the collapse of the British Empire in Asia. His grand strategy, codenamed Operation Yugo, was breathtaking in its scope. By launching a massive, multi-pronged invasion from occupied Burma into the mountains of northeastern India, he intended to encircle and annihilate the British Fourth Corps at Imphal. But that was only the first phase. With the British front line eradicated, Mutaguchi planned to sweep into the plains of Assam. This would allow him to sever the vital airfields used to supply Allied forces in China, the famous route known as flying over the hump, starving the Chinese resistance of American weapons and aviation fuel. Even more ambitiously, Mutaguchi genuinely believed that a successful Japanese breakthrough would trigger a massive, unstoppable anti-British uprising across the entire Indian subcontinent. Bolstered by Subhas Chandra Bose and his Indian National Army, who were fighting alongside the Japanese, Mutaguchi envisioned himself as a historic conqueror, riding a white horse through the streets of Delhi as the liberator of India. He was so confident in this political and military fantasy that he had already drafted his victory proclamations before his troops had even crossed the border. But buried beneath this grand strategic vision was a fatal, glaring flaw, a near impossible logistical reality that Mutaguchi simply chose to ignore. To reach Imphal and Kohima, the 15th Army had to cross the wide Chindwin River and then navigate through miles of some of the most unforgiving, malaria-infested, jungle-choked mountain ranges on the planet. There were no paved roads. There were barely dirt tracks. Motorized transport was entirely out of the question for the northern thrust. Mutaguchi's solution to this logistical nightmare was shocking in its primitive brutality. He instituted what he called the Genghis Khan method. He ordered his men to carry up to 3 weeks of their own rations on their backs, creating an agonizing physical burden for soldiers climbing steep mountain trails. To supplement these meagre supplies, the army commandeered thousands of oxen, cattle, sheep, and elephants, herding them through the dense jungle to serve as mobile rations and pack animals. When his own logistics officers warned him that moving large armies across the Indo-Burmese border without proper supply lines was military suicide, Mutaguchi fired them. He famously declared that the Japanese soldier did not need food or logistics, only the martial spirit of the emperor and a willingness to fight. He was also racing a ticking clock. The invasion was launched in March of 1944. Within months, the spring monsoon would arrive, turning the jungle tracks into impassable rivers of mud, effectively trapping his army without any hope of resupply. The entire operation relied on capturing British supply depots before the rains began. This reckless disregard for logistics sparked a bitter, toxic feud within the Japanese command, specifically between Mutaguchi and the man directly tasked with capturing Kohima, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, commander of the 31st Division. The animosity between the two men was deeply personal, rooted in old, bloody factional rivalries within the Imperial Japanese Army dating back to the 1930s. They despised each other. Sato was a pragmatic, battle-hardened commander who looked at the maps, assessed the jungle terrain, and immediately realized that his 15,000 men were being ordered into an operational death trap. Sato was ordered to march his entire division through the dense terrain of the Somra Tract, seize the Kohima Ridge, cut the road to Imphal, and then hold the line against inevitable British counterattacks. When Sato demanded a realistic plan for ammunition and food resupply, Mutaguchi's staff essentially told him to scavenge what he could from the enemy. Sato marched his 15,000 men into the dark canopy of the jungle, harbouring a furious, cynical resentment toward his commanding officer. He was fully aware that starvation, disease, and the jungle itself were a far greater threat to his division than the British army, and he privately vowed that he would not let his men die simply to fuel Mutaguchi's vanity. While this massive, heavily armed and quietly mutinous Japanese force hacked its way through the undergrowth toward India, the British High Command remained fatally blind to the danger. Field Marshal William Slim, commanding the 14th Army, had anticipated a major Japanese offensive aimed at Imphal, but Allied intelligence had vastly underestimated the enemy's capabilities. British planners believed it was physically impossible for the Japanese to move anything larger than a single regiment through the mountainous terrain toward Kohima. They were dead wrong. An entire division of 15,000 men was moving toward a town that was essentially undefended. Because of this intelligence failure, Kohima was in an abysmal state of preparation. It was not designed to be a fortress. It was a picturesque colonial administrative hub, scattered across a series of steep wooded ridges. It featured a civilian hospital, an oven brick bakery, red-roofed bungalows, a clubhouse, and the sprawling terraced garden of the Deputy Commissioner, Charles Pawsey. When the realization finally hit that a massive Japanese force was just days away, panic rippled through the regional command. Attempts to fortify the ridge were chaotic and tragically inadequate. There were no deep trench networks. There were no reinforced concrete bunkers. The garrison desperately requested materials to build defences, but faced critical shortages of something as fundamental to modern warfare as barbed wire. The earth on the ridge was incredibly rocky, making it nearly impossible to dig deep foxholes before the enemy arrived. The human element of the defence was just as chaotic. The defence of Kohima was initially handed to Colonel Hugh Richards, who arrived to find a logistical nightmare. Units were being moved in and out of the area by contradictory orders from a panicked higher command. Troops would arrive, begin to dig in, and then immediately be ordered down the road to Dimapur. By the time the Japanese vanguard finally severed the road and closed the ring around the ridge in early April, the force left trapped inside Kohima was a fragmented, hastily assembled patchwork. Out of the roughly 2,500 men inside the perimeter, barely 1,500 were capable of holding a rifle in combat. The core of the defence relied on a single regular infantry battalion that had been rushed up the mountain at the last possible moment, the 4th Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment. Standing alongside them was a disparate, improvised brotherhood of soldiers who had never trained to fight as a unified command. There were fierce troops from the Rajput Regiment and Nepalese Gurkhas from the Assam Rifles, renowned for their skill in the jungle. There were detachments of Sikh signallers desperately trying to maintain communications. And filling the gaps in the fragile perimeter were hundreds of men who were never supposed to see frontline combat. Bakers, clerks, mechanics, administrative staff, and walking wounded from the local field hospital were handed Lee Enfield rifles, pointed toward the tree line, and told to hold their ground at all costs. It was a garrison of rear echelon personnel, bracing for the impact of one of the most lethal infantry forces on Earth. Mutaguchi had calculated the movement of armies, the capture of depots, and the collapse of the British front line. He had factored in the mountains, ignored the logistics, and dismissed the monsoons. But as the 15,000 men of the 31st Division finally broke out of the dense foliage and looked up toward the undefended administrative bungalows of the Kohima Ridge, the Japanese High Command remained entirely unaware of the one crucial element they had fatally misjudged. It was a variable not listed on any military map or unit roster. It was the people who actually called these mountains home. Mutaguchi's grand strategy was built on a fundamental political assumption: the belief that the indigenous populations of the British Empire would eagerly rise up and welcome the Japanese as liberators. The Imperial Army anticipated that as they marched into India, the local tribes would immediately turn against their colonial administrators, providing the Japanese with local guides, free labour, and a sudden collapse of Allied intelligence. In the rugged Naga Hills surrounding Kohima, that assumption violently fell apart. The Japanese had completely misjudged the loyalty of the Naga people, a fierce, independent network of indigenous tribes who knew every hidden ravine and jungle track in the region. And that loyalty had been cemented by one specific man, Charles Pawsey, the British District Commissioner of the Naga Hills. Pawsey was an unconventional administrator who had spent over a decade living among the Naga, learning their dialects, respecting their customs, and advocating for their interests. As the Japanese 31st Division began pouring over the border, the British military ordered all civilians and non-essential personnel to immediately evacuate the Kohima Ridge and flee toward the safety of Dimapur. Pawsey flatly refused the order. He knew that if the district's highest authority abandoned the local population to the advancing Imperial Army, the trust he had built over a decade would instantly evaporate. His decision to stay behind, knowing full well he would likely be captured or killed, sent a powerful, stabilizing shockwave through the local communities. If Pawsey was staying, the Naga was staying. This decision immediately transformed the tactical reality on the ground. The Japanese expected to move blindly through the jungle, relying on their own maps and aggressive scouting. Instead, they walked into a deeply hostile environment where thousands of invisible eyes watched their every move. The Naga effectively became a vast, decentralized intelligence network operating directly behind enemy lines. Long before the Japanese vanguard reached the Kohima Ridge, Naga runners were slipping through the dense foliage, arriving at the British perimeter to deliver exact, real-time intelligence on enemy troop movements, numbers, and approach vectors. The British garrison, despite its chaotic organisation, suddenly possessed an extraordinary advantage. They knew exactly where the Japanese were coming from. But the Naga did not just provide information, they actively interfered with the Japanese advance. They guided Allied patrols through hidden paths, allowing them to ambush Japanese columns and melt back into the jungle. As the battle intensified and the British perimeter began to shrink, Naga villagers risked their lives to evacuate severely wounded soldiers, carrying them down treacherous mountain trails while under heavy sniper fire, navigating terrain that was completely inaccessible to standard military ambulances. For the Japanese High Command, this was a severe psychological and tactical blow. They were not fighting a disorganized colonial administration. They were fighting an entrenched enemy, supported by a fiercely loyal local population. Yet, intelligence and local support alone cannot stop bullets. The Naga provided the defenders with crucial time and awareness, but they could not alter the crushing mathematical reality bearing down on the Kohima Ridge. The Japanese had arrived in overwhelming force. They had established artillery positions on the surrounding high ground, and they were preparing to tighten the noose. The makeshift garrison of clerks and bakers was about to face the full, unmitigated wrath of a veteran Imperial division. forcing the defence into a rapidly shrinking perimeter where there was nowhere left to run. By the first week of April, the reality of the Japanese encirclement had transformed the geography of Kohima from a picturesque hill station into an unrecognisable, cratered moonscape. The Japanese 31st Division did not attack the British perimeter by attempting a single, massive frontal assault. They applied a terrifying, methodical strangulation. General Sato understood that the makeshift garrison was entirely cut off from the Dimapur road. There would be no immediate reinforcements, no supply convoys, and no retreat. Therefore, the Japanese strategy was to slowly crush the British positions under the weight of continuous, unrelenting pressure from the surrounding high ground. The Kohima defence was anchored across a series of interconnected steep ridges. Jail Hill, Detail Hill, the Field Supply Depot, and the central redoubt known as Garrison Hill. Over the course of the first few days, the Japanese effectively utilised their mountain artillery to systematically dismantle the outer defences. Because the rocky soil of Kohima made it nearly impossible to dig deep trenches, the defenders were often forced to rely on shallow scrapes, hastily assembled timber breastworks, and sandbags that were quickly pulverised by high explosive shells. As the days dragged on, the Japanese artillery barrages became the inescapable rhythm of life within the perimeter. But the true terror arrived when the sun went down. The Imperial Japanese Army was arguably the most proficient night-fighting force in the world at that time. They used the darkness to offset the Allied advantage in sheer firepower. Night after night, waves of Japanese infantry would quietly slip through the dense undergrowth, bypassing the scattered British listening posts, and suddenly emerge just yards from the defensive lines. The fighting would instantly devolve into chaotic, point-blank firefights lit only by the stroboscopic flashes of muzzle bursts and exploding grenades. For the men inside the perimeter, the seasoned veterans of the Royal West Kents, fighting shoulder to shoulder with terrified postal clerks and wounded men who had hobbled out of the field hospital, these night attacks became a psychological torture. The Japanese would probe the lines, looking for any gap, any weakness. When they found one, they would exploit it ruthlessly, pouring men into the breach. The defenders had to constantly reposition their dwindling reserves to plug these gaps, shrinking their perimeter yard by bloody yard. Daylight offered no relief. As soon as the sun rose over the Naga Hills, the Japanese snipers went to work. Sato's sharpshooters had climbed high into the sprawling canopy of the surrounding jungle, strapping themselves into the upper branches of towering trees. From these elevated, heavily camouflaged positions, they possessed clear lines of sight directly into the British trenches. Movement above ground level became synonymous with death. If a British soldier stood up to stretch his cramped legs or reached over a parapet to retrieve a dropped ammunition magazine, he would be instantly targeted. The garrison was pinned to the earth. They were forced to crawl on their stomachs through the suffocating red dust, unable to safely evacuate their dead, unable to communicate effectively between platoons, and increasingly isolated in their own shallow holes. But the lethal combination of artillery, night assaults, and sniper fire was not the primary threat to the garrison's survival. The true enemy, the one that threatened to break the defence before a single Japanese soldier breached Garrison Hill, was dehydration. When the siege began, the primary water supply for the Kohima Ridge was a series of large, exposed, galvanised iron tanks. Within the first 48 hours of the bombardment, Japanese mortar crews had zeroed in on these tanks. The shrapnel from the explosions easily pierced the thin metal, and thousands of gallons of precious, irreplaceable water simply drained away into the muddy soil. Almost overnight, a garrison of over 1,000 fighting men, enduring the stifling heat of the Indian Spring and the intense physical exertion of constant combat, was left with virtually nothing to drink. The situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. Without water, men cannot digest the hard biscuits of their field rations. Without water, combat medics cannot clean wounds, mix plaster, or administer basic aid to the soaring number of casualties. Throats swelled, tongues cracked, and the physical stamina of the defenders began to plummet. The only remaining water source was a small, muddy spring located in a ravine just outside the main defensive perimeter, in an area heavily swept by Japanese machine gun fire. Water retrieval became a suicide mission. Desperate men would wait for the dead of night, crawling out of their trenches with clusters of empty canvas buckets. They had to navigate blindly through the darkness, terrified of triggering a tripwire or alerting a Japanese listening post. They would reach the spring, which was little more than a muddy seep, and painstakingly fill their containers with brown, unfiltered liquid. Often, Japanese snipers would hear the faint splashing or the clinking of a canteen. The crack of an Arisaka rifle would echo through the ravine, and the water party would be forced to drag their wounded comrades back up the hill, leaving the precious water behind. The rationing became incredibly severe. Men were reduced to less than a cup of muddy water a day, forcing them to drain the radiators of abandoned vehicles just to survive. Coupled with this agonizing thirst was a catastrophic lack of sleep. Because the Japanese launched their heaviest infantry assaults at night and maintained constant sniper pressure during the day, the concept of a secure rear echelon vanished. There was no safe zone where a platoon could rotate off the line to rest. Every man, from the hardened corporals of the Royal West Kents to the administrative officers who had never fired a weapon in anger, was required to stand in the line, hour after hour, day after day. The sleep deprivation compounded the physical exhaustion, leading to vivid auditory and visual hallucinations. Men would stare into the dark tree line, their exhausted brains turning the shadows of swaying branches into the silhouettes of advancing Japanese soldiers, triggering frantic, wasteful bursts of Bren gunfire that only served to reveal their positions to the enemy. Yet, amidst this rapid physical and psychological deterioration, the defence held. It held not because of grand strategy or superior military engineering, but because of the sheer, uncompromising grit of individual men making decisions at the absolute limit of their endurance. The defence of the ridge was fractured into small, isolated pockets of resistance, and each sector produced its own desperate actions. One of the most critical of these occurred on April 8th, in the sector holding the remains of the civilian bakery. A forward platoon of the Royal West Kents had been pinned down for days by a heavily fortified Japanese machine gun post. The Japanese had dragged a heavy weapon to the crest of a nearby rise, establishing an interlocking field of fire that was systematically shredding the British defences. The position was so well camouflaged and heavily protected by riflemen that a direct assault by a squad was considered tactical suicide. Lance Corporal John Harmon, a 29-year-old soldier who had been commanding a section of the pinned-down platoon, recognised that if the machine gun was not silenced, his entire position would be overrun by nightfall. The heavy weapon was methodically dismantling their sandbag barricades, and the casualty rate was unsustainable. Harmon did not ask for volunteers. He did not radio for a non-existent artillery strike. He simply told his men to lay down covering fire, unclipped a pair of Mills bomb grenades from his webbing, and crawled out of his trench alone. Using the cratered terrain and the shattered remains of the bakery walls for cover, Harmon began a slow, agonizingly tense crawl toward the Japanese bunker. The air above him was snapping with enemy fire, but he managed to reach the blind spot of the pillbox. Pulling the pin on his grenade, he held the lever down, waited a fraction of a second, and threw it directly into the firing slit. The concussive blast instantly silenced the weapon. Without hesitating, Harmon rushed the position, eliminating the surviving crew. In a display of almost incomprehensible calm, he then picked up the heavy Japanese machine gun, hoisted it onto his shoulder, and walked back to his own lines, slamming the captured weapon down in front of his stunned platoon. But the sector was not secure. Shortly after he returned, a second Japanese position, a deeply dug-in rifle pit containing a sniper and several infantrymen, began laying down highly accurate fire onto the Royal West Kents, pinning them down once again. The momentum of the defence was faltering. Knowing that his platoon could not hold their ground under this renewed pressure, Harmon once again ordered his men to lay down a base of fire. This time, there was no slow crawl. Harmon fixed his bayonet, grabbed his Lee-Enfield rifle, and charged directly at the Japanese position across the open ground. It was a solitary, desperate sprint against an entrenched enemy. Firing from the hip as he ran, Harmon managed to reach the edge of the pit. He shot the sniper and engaged the remaining soldiers at point-blank range, clearing the position single-handedly. But as he turned to make his way back to his trench, a burst of heavy machine gun fire from a hidden Japanese position further up the slope caught him in the open. Struck multiple times, he collapsed onto the red dirt. His platoon desperately dragged him back into the safety of the trench. As his commanding officer knelt beside him in the mud, trying to stem the massive bleeding, Harmon looked up, his breathing shallow, and simply said, "I got a lot. It was worth it." He died minutes later. John Harmon was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions, but his sacrifice was emblematic of the entire siege. The defence of Kohima was not sustained by complex manoeuvring. It was sustained by hundreds of individual, localised acts of extreme violence and personal sacrifice, buying the garrison another hour, another night, another inch of ground. While the British and Indian defenders were slowly being bled white, a different kind of catastrophe was unfolding just a few hundred yards away, on the other side of the shrinking perimeter. From the perspective of the Allied High Command, the Japanese 31st Division appeared as an unstoppable monolithic force, an endless tide of highly disciplined infantry crashing against the fragile British lines. But inside the Japanese command tents, concealed in the jungle canopy overlooking the ridge, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato was watching his own division bleed to death. The fundamental flaw of Operation Yugo, General Mutaguchi's arrogant dismissal of logistics, was now manifesting in horrifying reality. The Japanese had executed a brilliant operational maneuver by crossing the Chindwin River and marching 15,000 men through impenetrable jungle to lay siege to Kohima. But having arrived, they were entirely unequipped to break a determined static defence. Mutaguchi's plan assumed that the British would simply collapse in panic, abandoning their supply depots for the Japanese to loot. But the garrison had not broken, and the vast stores of Dimapur remained infuriatingly out of reach down the mountain. Sato's men were rapidly running out of artillery shells. They had dragged their lightweight mountain guns through the jungle, but these weapons lacked the penetrative power to instantly shatter the British timber and earth bunkers. To take ground, Sato had to rely on his infantry, sending them into relentless, close-quarters frontal assaults. The casualty rates were staggering. Veteran companies that had fought across China and Southeast Asia were being decimated in brutal hand-to-hand combat over meaningless patches of shattered earth. Worse than the ammunition shortage was the total absence of food. The method of using livestock as mobile rations had failed completely. The oxen and cattle they had herded through the jungle had either died of exhaustion, fallen off steep trails, or been consumed weeks ago. The division's rations were exhausted. Mutaguchi's headquarters back in Burma had promised Sato that supply columns would follow his advance, but the difficult terrain and the harassment by Allied aircraft made this impossible. Not a single bag of rice had reached the 31st Division since they crossed the border. Sato ordered his men to forage, expecting them to live off the land. But the Naga people, fiercely loyal to Charles Pawsey and the British, had stripped the surrounding villages bare. They had hidden their rice stores, driven their livestock deep into the mountains, and abandoned their settlements. The Japanese soldiers were reduced to boiling jungle roots, eating grass and scavenging through the uniforms of their dead comrades for stray grains of rice. As starvation set in, disease followed. Malaria, dysentery and beriberi began to sweep through the Japanese camps. Without medical supplies or proper rations, a wound that would normally take a soldier out of action for a few weeks became a death sentence. The tropical heat accelerated infections, and the Japanese medical tents were overwhelmed. Sato's division, previously one of the most formidable combat units in the Imperial Army, was physically disintegrating. The psychological toll on the Japanese command was profound. Sato grew increasingly furious with Mutaguchi. He was receiving radio transmissions from 15th Army headquarters ordering him to immediately annihilate the Kohima garrison and march on Dimapur, completely ignoring Sato's desperate requests for food and ammunition. Mutaguchi's staff, sitting safely far behind the lines, viewed Sato's inability to break a tiny garrison of clerks and bakers as a lack of aggressive spirit. Sato, in turn, realized that he had been sent on a suicide mission by a commander who refused to acknowledge the physical reality of the battlefield. The aggressive confidence that had defined the initial Japanese invasion was rapidly souring into a bitter, desperate frustration. The Japanese soldiers fighting in the trenches were no longer fighting for the glory of the empire or the conquest of India. They were fighting because breaking the British lines was the only way they might find something to eat. This mutual degradation, a starving, disease-ridden attacking force throwing itself against a dehydrated, exhausted, and hopelessly outnumbered defending force, created a crucible of violence that defied military logic. The battlefield was contracting. Under the sheer weight of Japanese numbers and the continuous night attacks, the outer British positions on Jail Hill, Detail Hill and the Field Supply Depot were slowly, agonisingly overrun. The defenders were forced into a fighting retreat, pulling their wounded back up the slopes, giving ground only when their trenches were physically swamped by Japanese infantry. By the middle of April, the entire defence of Kohima had been compressed into a shockingly small footprint. The perimeter, which had originally spanned several hills, was now confined entirely to the slopes of Garrison Hill and the immediate grounds of the District Commissioner's bungalow. It is here that the scale of the Battle of Kohima ceases to be a story of grand strategy and becomes a nightmare of terrifying intimacy. The District Commissioner's bungalow was perched on a terrace cut into the side of the hill. Below the bungalow, meticulously carved into the slope, was a standard, rectangular, asphalt and grass tennis court. Before the invasion, it had been a symbol of colonial leisure, a place where British officers and administrators played in the cool evening air. Now, it was the absolute epicentre of the front line. The Japanese had fought their way up the terraces, capturing the lower edges of the property and digging into the jungle line just beyond the court. The Royal West Kents, supported by the remnants of the Assam Regiment and the unlikeliest of combat soldiers, had dug their final defensive trench right along the court's upper baseline. The opposing armies were no longer separated by miles of jungle or even hundreds of yards of open ground. They were separated by the exact dimensions of a tennis court. The distance between the British trenches and the Japanese forward rifle pits was less than 20 yards. This proximity stripped the battle of all conventional tactics. Artillery could no longer be used effectively by either side. The lines were so dangerously close that dropping a mortar shell ran the absolute risk of annihilating friendly troops. Rifles became almost too unwieldy to aim over the parapets before drawing immediate, point-blank fire from the opposite baseline. The primary weapon of the siege became the hand grenade. For days on end, the two forces engaged in a surreal, lethal exchange across the ruined, white lines of the court. Men would pull the pins on Mills bombs or Japanese fragmentation grenades, wait a terrifying 2 seconds to prevent the enemy from throwing them back, and lob them over the shattered remains of the tennis net. The explosions tore up the asphalt, turning the court into a blasted, cratered wasteland. The psychological pressure of this proximity was unbearable. The British defenders could clearly hear the Japanese soldiers talking, coughing, and preparing their weapons. They could hear the metallic clink of a bayonet being fixed, the racking of a bolt, the whispered commands of Japanese officers preparing for a night charge. At night, the darkness across the 20 yards of grass was absolute, forcing the exhausted defenders to stare into the pitch black, waiting for the inevitable moment when a wave of screaming infantry would surge across the net. When the night attacks came, they were incredibly fast and utterly barbaric. Japanese soldiers would leap from their trenches, sprinting across the court to hurl themselves directly into the British lines. The fighting would instantly dissolve into primitive, close-quarters slaughter. Men fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, rifle butts, and bare hands in the dark. A trench would fall to the Japanese, and hours later, a desperate British counterattack, fueled by adrenaline and the terrifying knowledge that there was nowhere left to retreat, would push them back out, leaving the narrow ditches choked with the dead of both sides. By the time the calendar turned past the middle of April, the men holding the baseline of the tennis court had reached the absolute limit of human endurance. They were coated in a thick layer of red dust and dried blood. They had not slept for more than a few fragmented minutes in over a week. Their water ration was practically non-existent, their ammunition was critically low, and the smell of the unburied dead lying in the baking sun between the trenches was suffocating. The garrison was completely isolated from the outside world. The radio operators were desperately trying to maintain contact with Dimapur, but the static field transmissions offered no immediate salvation. They were trapped on a tiny, shrinking island of high ground, surrounded by a sea of hostile jungle, and thousands of desperate, starving Japanese soldiers who were preparing for what surely had to be the final, fatal assault. The perimeter could not shrink any further. There were no more hills to fall back to. If the Japanese managed to cross those final 20 yards and take the upper baseline of the tennis court, the ridge would fall. The road to Dimapur would open, and Mutaguchi's gateway into India would be decisively breached. As night fell over the shattered canopy of Garrison Hill, the defenders checked their remaining magazines, fixed their bayonets, and stared across the ruined net, waiting for the end. On the morning of April 18th, the exhausted men holding the baseline of the tennis court heard a sound that finally cut through the relentless crack of enemy rifles. It was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of artillery. British artillery, firing from the valley below, followed by the grinding roar of advancing tanks. The vanguard of the British 2nd Division, fighting its way up the mountain highway, had finally smashed through the Japanese roadblocks and breached the perimeter. The original garrison, the Clarks, the walking wounded, and the battered remnants of the Royal West Kents were relieved. They staggered down the hill, hollow-eyed and coated in red dust, leaving the shattered asphalt behind. The siege of Garrison Hill was over. But the Battle of Kohima was not. In conventional military history, the arrival of a relief column often signals the end of the narrative, a triumphant conclusion to a desperate stand. At Kohima, the arrival of the 2nd Division merely triggered a second, far more agonizing phase of the conflict. The Japanese had failed to capture the central administrative ridge, but they had not retreated. Instead, General Sato's 31st Division simply consolidated their hold on the dominant surrounding heights. The tactical reality instantly flipped. The Allied forces were no longer defending a tiny, shrinking perimeter. They were now forced to launch a massive uphill offensive against a deeply entrenched enemy. This second phase became a grinding, methodical nightmare. The Japanese had utilized their time on the heights to construct a vast, interconnected network of subterranean bunkers. Carved deep into the rocky slopes and reinforced with thick jungle timber, these positions were practically immune to standard artillery barrages. To dislodge them, fresh British and Indian infantry had to claw their way up near vertical inclines under constant sniper fire. Every few yards, they encountered overlapping fields of machine gun fire pouring from hidden slits in the earth. Taking a single hill often required days of grueling close-quarters combat, clearing bunkers one by one, only to face an immediate, fierce Japanese counterattack the moment the sun went down. What made this offensive so uniquely terrifying was the condition of the enemy they were fighting. The Japanese defenders were entirely cut off from supply lines. They were starving, ravaged by malaria, and surviving on boiled roots and muddy water. Yet their physical degradation only seemed to harden their resistance. They fought with the fatalistic intensity of men who already considered themselves dead, holding their firing positions until the exact moment they were overrun. And then the sky broke. The dreaded spring monsoon arrived, unleashing torrential sheets of rain that turned the steep ridges into slick, impassable waterfalls of mud. Tanks bogged down up to their hulls. The battlefield transformed into a waterlogged labyrinth where simply climbing a slope required superhuman effort. As the Allied forces hurled wave after wave of men into this muddy ascent, the sheer irrational stubbornness of the Japanese defense seemed unbreakable from the outside. But deep inside the dark, flooded command bunkers of the 31st Division, the invisible threads of military discipline were beginning to snap. General Sato watched his men being systematically erased by Allied firepower and monsoon disease, while his radios continued to spit out impossible, arrogant demands from a high command that still refused to send a single grain of rice. The breaking point was no longer a question of if, but when. By late May, the Japanese 31st Division was no longer a functioning military unit. It was a starving, desperate mob trapped in a flooded graveyard. Sato's command post, dug deep into the slopes of the Naga Hills, had become a theatre of sheer human misery. The monsoon rains poured incessantly through the rotting timber roofs, turning the dirt floors into knee-deep, stagnant swamps. His men were dying not just from the relentless barrage of British artillery clawing up the ridges, but from severe, agonising malnutrition. Soldiers who had once marched victoriously across Asia were now reduced to chewing on jungle ferns, stripping the bark off trees, and boiling their leather rifle slings just to ease the violent cramps in their stomachs. Malaria, cholera and typhus swept through the flooded trenches, wiping out entire platoons before they could even fire a single shot. Yet, amidst the deafening roar of the monsoon rain and the constant thunder of Allied guns, The radio in Sato's bunker kept clicking. General Mutaguchi's 15th Army headquarters, sitting comfortably hundreds of miles away in the secure rear echelons of Burma, remained completely, stubbornly detached from this grim reality. Mutaguchi's entire grand strategy had relied on capturing British supplies. Because Sato had failed to break the garrison and take the Dimapur depots, Mutaguchi blamed him for the entire logistical collapse. The breaking point arrived in the form of a direct operational mandate. Mutaguchi commanded Sato to hold his ground, launch a renewed offensive, and fight to the absolute death. In the Imperial Japanese Army, a direct order from a superior was practically a divine decree. To disobey was unthinkable. To retreat without authorization was the ultimate treason, punishable by court-martial and execution. The Bushido Code demanded absolute, unquestioning compliance and a glorious death in combat over the humiliation of withdrawal. But Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato looked out at the skeletal remains of his once proud division, watching his men cough up blood in the mud, and decided he had had enough. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary acts of insubordination in the history of the Japanese military. Sato didn't just quietly fall back, he lashed out. He drafted a furious, unprecedented transmission and sent it in the clear, directly to Mutaguchi's staff. Sato formally accused his own high command of gross incompetence, tactical ignorance, and delusional planning. He bluntly stated that the 15th Army had failed in its most fundamental duty to supply its troops, and therefore he was relieving himself of the obligation to obey their suicidal orders. He declared that his men were not dying for the glory of the empire. They were dying because of Mutaguchi's vanity. When the shocked staff officers at headquarters demanded an explanation and furiously reiterated the order to fight to the death, Sato made a decision that sealed the fate of the entire invasion of India. He walked over to his communications officer and gave an order that amounted to professional suicide. He ordered him to turn off the radio. The machine was powered down. The line went dead. General Sato had deliberately severed communications with his commanding officer. On May 31st, 1944, acting completely on his own authority, Sato issued an order that defied centuries of rigid Japanese military tradition. He commanded the 31st Division to abandon their defensive positions, turn their backs on Kohima, and begin a full-scale retreat back toward Burma. It was a staggering collapse of discipline at the highest levels of the imperial command structure. The physical battle was still raging across the terraced hillsides, but the strategic threat to the Indian subcontinent evaporated the moment that radio was switched off. Sato knew his mutiny would almost certainly end with his disgrace and execution, but he chose to save whatever was left of his men over sacrificing them to a broken, impossible strategy. However, the retreat he initiated would not deliver his soldiers to safety. By abandoning the high ground and marching away from the Allied guns, Sato was plunging his starving, sick, and exhausted division directly into the unforgiving maw of the Burmese jungle. The decision to defy his orders had ended the siege, but it was about to trigger one of the most horrific death marches in modern military history. Sato's defiant retreat did not save his men. It merely condemned them to a slower, more agonizing demise. As the remnants of the 31st Division stumbled back toward the Chindwin River, the full fury of the monsoon broke over the mountains. The jungle tracks dissolved into deep, churning rivers of mud. Soldiers too weak to walk were simply left by the side of the trail, silently surrendering to malaria and starvation. The withdrawal route became a grim, literal road of bones, littered with abandoned artillery, rusting rifles, and the unburied dead of an imperial army that had starved itself to destruction. Operation Yugo, General Mutaguchi's grand vision of riding a white horse through Delhi, evaporated in the torrential Burmese rain. On June 22, 1944, at milestone 109 on the road connecting Kohima to Imphal, the vanguard of the British 2nd Division pushing south finally linked up with the 5th Indian Division fighting its way north. The road was open. The siege of Imphal was lifted. The Japanese invasion of India had been decisively, irrevocably shattered. But the victory that halted the Japanese Empire at the gates of India was not won by Britain alone. The narrative of Kohima is too often simplified into a story of colonial resilience, but the blood soaked into the ridges belonged to a vast, deeply diverse coalition. The line was held by Nepalese Gurkhas fighting in the dark, by Rajput and Assam infantrymen who stood fast when their perimeters collapsed, and by Sikh signallers who desperately kept the lifelines of communication open under relentless shellfire. And without the Naga scouts who refused to abandon their home, who tracked Japanese columns through the canopy, and who carried the wounded down treacherous slopes under sniper fire, the garrison would have undoubtedly been erased in the first week. Today, Garrison Hill is silent. The artillery craters have been filled and the shattered trees have regrown. The district commissioner's bungalow is gone, but the exact footprint of the tennis court remains. Only now, there are no white lines painted on the grass. Instead, the baseline and the service boxes are defined by rows of bronze plaques and pristine white headstones. The men who fought across the ruined net now rest beneath it, buried shoulder to shoulder in the exact spots where they fell. It is here, standing among the quiet graves on this meticulously manicured lawn, that the sheer scale of the tragedy comes into sharp focus, leaving us with one final, enduring paradox. The Japanese Empire launched a theatre-altering invasion designed to conquer a subcontinent, shatter global supply lines, and orchestrate the collapse of British power in Asia. It was a vision of conquest drawn on maps spanning thousands of miles, built on the expectation of sweeping manoeuvres and the destruction of entire armies. But that vast imperial ambition did not die in a massive clash of armour on the open plains of Assam. It was not broken against the reinforced concrete of an impenetrable fortress, nor was it outmanoeuvred by a brilliant strategic encirclement. The momentum of an entire army and the fate of the Indian subcontinent bled to death in the suffocating space between two white lines on a ruined recreational court. The march to conquer India was ultimately stopped on a patch of suburban lawn, over a distance so absurdly small that an ordinary man could sprint across it in less than 5 seconds.